New merchandise available on jg9shop.com. From redesigned 39.6 merchandise to backpacks to ugly sweaters to bucket hats, we've got it all. Plus, now available, we officially have Drink the Spike mugs and glasses, for those who like their drinks more than they like quarterbacks that spike the ball into the ground on every single play. Go to jg9shop.com for the latest JG9 merch for this holiday season. And now, on with our feature presentation. Sometimes, we say things that are intended to be compliments, but come across in a completely horrible way. What's intended to be a praiseworthy moment instead becomes a moment where the other party takes offense to it. And in the history of the NFL on Thanksgiving, it's safe to say that there's no comment and no moment that exemplifies this more than this one right here. Because the Dallas Cowboys gave thanks to the Cleveland Browns and their starting quarterback, Brian Sipe, for giving them some of the greatest bulletin board material of all time. Prior to a 1982 game between the Cowboys and the Browns, quarterback Brian Sipe intended to be extremely complimentary of the Cowboys defense, meaning no disrespect to the team and the organization whatsoever. Instead, what followed was a comment that got the Cowboys up in arms, that left the Cowboys feeling incredibly disrespected, and gave the Cowboys players targeted by the comments even more fuel and motivation to go out there and win the game in front of a national television audience. And this is the story behind one of the stupidest comments and moments in the history of the holiday. Before I talk about the controversial press conference and the incident in question, we need some context to understand how both teams were doing heading into the game, and how the targeted unit and players were doing. With how short the NFL season usually is, every game matters, and especially when you get to this point in the season by Thanksgiving, traditionally if you're in the playoff hunt, you don't have a whole lot of room for error. And this was especially true during the 1982 season, when you had just 9 games in the season thanks to the 2-month strike that shut down play for a while. In fact, the game we're going to talk about took place on November 25th, and the regular season did not start up again until November 21st, so we were just getting back into the swing of things and getting ready to resume play in the shortest season yet. And when the Browns and Cowboys entered the holiday, they were both sitting pretty with a record of 2-1. 8 teams in each conference made it to the postseason that year due to the weird Super Bowl tournament format change, and it seemed on the surface like any team that had a winning record was going to make it in. Aside from the fact that Thanksgiving games are always big just because of the platform they provide and because the whole country is watching, the weird format of the season made this game all the more important. Whoever won this game would in all likelihood only have to go 500 the rest of the way to make it into the postseason. Win this game, and barring a massive collapse, you're automatically in the playoffs, even if that might not be as great of an accomplishment as it was in previous years when the field was way more exclusive. Cleveland was in this position at 2-1 thanks in part to their strong defense. Through their first 3 games, the Browns allowed just 38 points, which was the fewest in the AFC, and was tied for the fewest in the NFL alongside the New Orleans Saints. In 2 of their 3 games, the Browns allowed just 7 points, just having their way with opposing offenses. As for the Cowboys, there were a bunch of reasons why they entered this game at 2-1 and above 500. They had Danny White under center, who was having a great start to the season, completing 2 out of every 3 passes and throwing 7 touchdowns while posting a passer rating of 98.9. To have a passer rating near 100 at a time where half the quarterbacks in the league were struggling to crack 70 was impressive. They had a stud at receiver in Tony Hill, who in the 2 games before the strike cracked the 100-yard mark, and even though it's incredibly early and slightly unrealistic, was on pace for 112 receptions and 1,848 yards in a 16-game season. But perhaps the biggest reason of all was an absolutely stout defensive line. If you asked people in 1982 what the best defensive line in all of football was, odds are most people would say the Dallas Cowboys. It's one of those units where there's not really a weak link on it. Any offensive line is going to have trouble stopping that front 4. On one end, you had Ed Too Tall Jones, the former first overall pick in the 1974 NFL Draft, and a player coming off of a Pro Bowl campaign in 1981. He was already a good player, and after coming back to the NFL following his brief retirement to pursue a career in boxing, he became even better. On the other end, you had Harvey Martin, a man who entered the season with 104 career sacks, 4 Pro Bowl appearances in the last 6 years, a 20-sack season in 1977, an appearance on the All-1970s team, and an AP Defensive Player of the Year and Super Bowl MVP award under his belt. Clogging up the middle on one side was John Dutton. The former top 5 pick from the Baltimore Colts was a 3-time Pro Bowler, and in his second season in the league in 1975, he led the NFL with 17 sacks. And on the other side, you had not just the star of that defense, but one of the greatest defensive tackles in the history of the sport in Randy White. He made it to 5 straight Pro Bowls, with 3 first-team All-Pro nominations in the past 4 years. He was a co-MVP at Super Bowl 12 alongside Martin, and was one of the best defensive tackles in the sport by this point, as he had a pretty good case for being number 1. There truly was not a weak spot on the line. Jones, Martin, Dutton, and White were 4 guys who all had accolades, and who were all still playing at a really high level. And the 1982 season, to start things off, was no different. For those 4 guys, it was business as usual. As I said earlier, maybe the biggest reason the Cowboys were above 500 by this point was their strong front 4. Going up against Neil Lomax of the St. Louis Cardinals, In a game where the Cowboys allowed just 7 points, the Cowboys defense sacked him 5 times for 42 yards. The secondary wasn't doing a whole lot, only recording 1 interception through the first 3 games, but the front 4 was consistently applying pressure and making life for opposing quarterbacks miserable. Cleveland Browns quarterback Brian Sipe recognized this, and knew just how good Dallas's defensive line was. Unfortunately for him, he picked about the worst way possible to express this sentiment. Before going any further, I've done plenty of videos on players who trash talk their opponent, only for it to backfire and completely blow up in their face. The player will intentionally say something that the opposing team can use as bulletin board material. If you want to see one of those videos, which happens to involve the Cowboys from 1978, when New York Jets head coach Walt Michaels said that the Cowboys were not a very good team, only for the Jets to lose badly to the Cowboys in the least surprising development of the century, then click the card in the upper right corner. But this is not one of those videos. When Brian Sipe spoke to the press about the Cowboys, he intended to be complimentary. His intentions were to praise Dallas's defense up front, but the choice of words did not make it seem that way. Someone asked Sipe about the Cowboys' secondary, which was not great, and again only had 1 interception in the previous 3 weeks. When the reporter said that the secondary was the supposed weak link, Sipe responded by saying, "That may be true, but they get a good pass rush off the artificial turf." Translation, even if their secondary is weak and isn't the greatest, their pass rush is that good that it doesn't really matter. And Sipe continued by saying, with those guys in your face, referring to Sutton, White, Martin, and Jones, they could have the Three Stooges out there covering passes. Again, the intention from this quote was simple and was not intended to be malicious or insulting in the slightest bit. Sipe had a great deal of respect for Dallas and their defensive line, to the point where anyone can play in the secondary when the pass rush is getting to the quarterback that quickly. The only problem? You can imagine how absolutely disrespectful the secondary felt by that comment. In the eyes of everyone that played and started in the secondary, from Michael Downs to Everson Walls to Benny Barnes to Dennis Thurman, they weren't any good. They were getting bailed out by their defensive line. If Sipe said something along the lines of their defense all around is really good, and their defensive line in particular is the best in football, that would be one thing. But to go and say that the Three Stooges could be back there and it wouldn't make a difference? Now the secondary had bulletin board material, even though Sipe did not intend for it to be bulletin board material whatsoever. The secondary had a mission. That mission? Prove that they belong. And with that, we head to Texas Stadium on this Thanksgiving Day in 1982 for this all-important interconference matchup. Aside from the previous implications I mentioned that this game had on the standings and the newly expanded playoff picture, the secondary wanted to destroy Sipe and make him eat his words. And that's exactly what they did. Oddly enough, this is not the first time I've done a video on this game, as a year ago, I talked about this game from the perspective of Tony Dorsett, who was badly injured and had no business being out on the field and playing. However, he scored 2 touchdowns, averaged close to 6 yards per carry, and had 116 rushing yards as the Cowboys won at 31-14. To learn more about that angle of the game, click the card in the upper right corner. As for Brian Sipe and the Cowboys secondary, to say that this was a rough one for Sipe and company would be a massive understatement. In the first quarter, with the Browns in Cowboy territory, Sipe drops back to pass and looks for wide receiver Dave Logan. Instead, it finds the arms of Everson Walls, who takes advantage of the poorly thrown pass and picks it off. One drive later, in the second quarter, Sipe is faced with a 3rd down situation. He gets picked off again, as this time, his pass finds its way into the arms of Michael Downs. In this half, the Cowboys already recorded more interceptions than they had all season up until that point. This secondary was coming to play on this Turkey Day. But they weren't done yet. How about one more interception on the very next drive? Because that's exactly what happened. This time, it was Bob Brewing who made the play, giving the Cowboys their 3rd pick of the first half. By the middle of the 3rd quarter, thanks to some atrocious play and thanks to Sipe taking some shots and beatings back there against that ferocious Dallas defensive line, including 3 sacks for a loss of 28 yards and a few quarterback hits, head coach Sam Rutigliano decided to pull the plug and remove Sipe from the game in favor of Paul McDonald. With Sipe in the game, the Browns scored no points. They'd lose 31-14 and were outscored 31-0 through the first 3 quarters. And when you break down the stats a bit more, this game was nothing short of a disaster for Sipe, as he struggled against the secondary of supposed Stooges. Sipe finished the game 11 for 23 with 85 yards passing, no touchdowns and 3 interceptions. Prior to this game, in a game where he threw at least 10 passes, the last time Sipe completed less than 50% of his passes and threw for under 100 yards was all the way back in 1977, when he did this in a game against the Houston Oilers. However, the Browns won that game. Here, they were shut out while he was in there. It was the first time he ever did this while throwing 3 interceptions in a game, and his passer rating was an abysmal 17.8, which was not only the worst passer rating he ever had in a game where he threw at least 10 passes, and was not only the worst passer rating he had since 1977, but was a passer rating so low that it's worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. It truly was the worst game of Brian Sipe's career. And after the game, you can bet that the Cowboys defensive backs were bragging about how they shut down Sipe, and how their secondary gave him fits all day long. Michael Downs, who had one of the 3 interceptions on Sipe, said that everyone took that comment personally, and that the comment made by Sipe was definitely bulletin board material. As he said, "We are the Rodney Dangerfields of the NFL because we don't have a lot of number 1 draft picks and we don't get a ton of respect. They might think we're not good football players, but today, we kinda proved them wrong." And it's safe to say that on this day, the Cowboys secondary definitely proved the critics and Sipe wrong. This is one of those situations where on one hand, you feel bad for Sipe. He meant no ill will by those comments whatsoever. He said those comments to praise and highlight just how good the Cowboys defensive line was. But on the other hand, you completely understand where the secondary was coming from. They felt incredibly disrespected that, according to Sipe, they weren't very good. They had nothing to do with the success of the Cowboys defense, and that anyone could be back there and do that job well. And if Thanksgiving is a holiday about feasting and eating, then the Cowboys secondary was definitely in the holiday spirit on this day in 1982, because they completely ate Brian Sipe up. Get your official Jaguar Gamer 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes, link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9, and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.